Hey, it's Hannah Burner from Giggly Squad, and we're partnering with Abercrombie for the launch of their new spring collection. I need a wardrobe that can handle a busy week in the city and go straight to a weekend getaway. Abercrombie's newest drop is full of dresses, sweaters, and layers that effortlessly do both. The piece that's stealing the show for me is the new reversible trench coat. It's a classic navy on one side and a coastal plaid on the other, the perfect spring staple. Get your closet ready for a full season of plans. Shop spring at Abercrombie & Fitch in the app, online, and in stores.
With almost 500,000 customers and over $1 trillion of secure payments, Bill isn't new to intelligent finance. It's the proven way to simplify bill pay and maximize cash flow. Want to learn more? Visit bill.com/proven for a special offer.
One popular way of thinking about the First World War is the question of competence. I mean, the great debate around the First World War that rages for much of the kind of like the century afterwards in Great Britain is around characters like Haig and French and people like that. And Wallenstein and the generals and the question of as to whether they were competent, whether they were fools, and there was this kind of revisionist argument by people like Gary Sheffield that sure they were on a bloody learning curve, and they figured it out in the end. And then when we talk about the causes of the Russian Revolution, military incompetence and defeats on the battlefield certainly make the Kaiser's rule less and less kind of durable. But today we're going to look at the military preparations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and ask ourselves why the Austro-Hungarian Empire had such profound weaknesses in its manpower and material before it went to war in 1914. Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today we're taking a step back a little bit. I've talked about the current crisis a lot in the last few days on here and over on Patreon, where I'm adding the odd little bit of video. And on that subject, some possible exciting, I say exciting for me maybe, ideas for the future. The hoster that I use can you can upload video, so I might be doing a few more video kind of things on the podcast, and you should be able to get those in your regular RSS feed. More on that when it happens, but obviously we do chat with interesting people most weeks, and so a bit of that kind of thing is always good. Okay, so we're talking today about the Habsburg Empire on the during the mobilization period during the July crisis in 1914, and obviously the war between the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Serbia, the mobilization against Serbia, is the kind of the key factor that triggers the kind of cascading effect throughout Europe in the summer of 1914. And so it's always interesting to look at the Austro-Hungarian army. Not enough is said about it, really. I mean, um, one of the problems with First World War, kind of not historiography, but kind of public history, the way it's publicly perceived, is that generally we look at the Western Front. Most of the time, when you look at famous novels like All Quiet on the Western Front, and biographies by people like Robert Graves and stuff like that, and war poetry and movies and all the kind of the literature and the culture of the First World War focuses, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, on the Western Front and the kind of the madness of the trenches. So combatants like Austria-Hungary that fought the Italians and the Russians, and we're in various other theatres as well. This rarely gets a look in, or an adequate one at the very least. So I'm pleased. I always return to it. It's such a good book. If you can get a copy of Ring of Steel by Alexander Watson, it really is a kind of a significant contribution to the writing on the First World War in Europe. And has I think it's about 10 or 12 years old now, but as a work has really stood the test of time. And this is the sort of thing that I kind of concern myself with, history books that on reflection were pretty good then and are still pretty good now. So I consider myself a bit of an authority on that subject. So we're looking at the problems of mobilizing men in the Habsburg army. And obviously, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a multi-ethnic empire, as Austro-Hungarian implies, and it kind of dominates a patchwork of nations and ethnicities from Central to Southeastern Europe. And this presents challenges. It presents challenges in recruitment and mobilization, actually more severe than, say, for example, the British Empire, which had soldiers on the Western Front that had come from Newfoundland and India, and everywhere in between. So, Alexander Watson writes, the Common Army's biggest problem with its men was it simply did not have enough. Its 1,687,000 strong field army was dwarfed by the 3.4 million soldiers of the mobilized Russian force. Additionally, the low proportion of the male population drafted in peace meant there was a relatively small pool of trained reserves to act as casualty replacements in war. The manpower pool from which the army recruited was very mixed. In the west of the empire, educational standards and the acceptance of state power were little different from that of Western nations. In peacetime, just 3% of German-speaking Austrians had attempted to dodge the 3-year from 1912 2-year military conscription. In the disgruntled but well-educated Czech lands, 6 to 7.3% of men ignored the summons to the colours. By contrast, Hungarians who still bore a grudge for the Habsburg soldiers' brutal suppression of their 1848 revolution and disliked the Common Army had an absentee rate before the war of a little over 25%. Worst of all, were the Galicia and South Slav lands, areas with much illiteracy and irredentist movements, as well as high immigration. So lots of your potentially best young men were getting on boats and going to America, and a variety of other places, but mainly America, where resistance in the decade of peace had risen to the point that over 1/3 of those mustered failed to present themselves. Of course, war was a very different situation. Punishment for disobedience was more severe, and a wave of patriotism did sweep the empire as hostilities broke out. Nonetheless, it was inevitable that units raised in different parts of the empire would, in war, display wildly different capabilities and performance. Skepticism about the loyalty of some peoples also prevailed. As the Habsburg war minister's aide-de-camp remarked of the South Slav reservists on the eve of war, they will arrive at their depots all confident, but they'll already be less willing when the time comes to march. When they attack over the last 1,000 meters, no one can give any sure guarantee. The army's main deficiencies in 1914, nonetheless, lay not contrary to what is often claimed in the loyalty or the willingness of its Slav soldiers, but rather in inadequate support, poor training, and, as the campaigns would reveal, spectacularly incompetent higher leadership. Its gravest material shortage was in modern artillery, a consequence of both inadequate funding and indecision and infighting about the specifications.
Hey, it's Hannah Burner from Giggly Squad, and we're partnering with Abercrombie for the launch of their new spring collection. I need a wardrobe that can handle a busy week in the city and go straight to a weekend getaway. Abercrombie's newest drop is full of dresses, sweaters, and layers that effortlessly do both. The piece that's stealing the show for me is the new reversible trench coat. It's a classic navy on one side and a coastal plaid on the other, the perfect spring staple. Get your closet ready for a full season of plans. Shop spring at Abercrombie & Fitch in the app, online, and in stores.
Over 90 of the top 100 U.S. accounting firms trust Bill to handle bill pay processes. Why? Because our tools are built on over $1 trillion of secure payments. We're not just moving money. We're powering financial workflows for 500,000 customers. That's a level of expertise you just can't fake. Ready to talk with an expert? Visit Bill.com/proven to get started and grab a $250 gift card as a thank you. Terms and conditions apply. See offer page for details.
To tip off this NBA season on FanDuel, you can choose your own rewards, which means you can play your game any way you want.
I get to choose my rewards?
Yep.
Great! Now, excuse me while I lock in.
All customers choose your own reward right now in the FanDuel app. 21 plus and present in select states. 18 plus in Kentucky. Opt-in required. Rewards are non-withdrawable. Restrictions apply, including bonus and token expiration, leg requirement, and max wager amount. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
For the new weaponry among the army's senior commanders. Now, this is kind of actually a real travesty, given the relative levels of industrialization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the, as Christopher Clark points out in Sleepwalkers, the highly kind of economically coherent, in sort of almost internal marketplace of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is really a kind of a relatively prosperous polity overall. And it's interesting to speculate why the German Empire, the Kaiserreich, doesn't really have this degree of disorganizational incompetence, but the Austro-Hungarians do. Habsburg Common Army divisions have 42 field artillery pieces, 8 to 10 more than first-line Serbian divisions, but far fewer than the 60 supporting Russian divisions. Worse still, only 2/3 of these guns were modern 80mm cannon. The others were obsolete 100mm field howitzers without recoil mechanisms for quick aiming and firing, or armoured shields for the gun team's protection. The heavy artillery, which comprised 8 9904 150mm howitzers in each corps, was similarly old-fashioned. All Habsburg gun barrels were cast of bronze rather than stronger steel, which made them heavy and limited their range. Even in Serbia, the 150mm howitzers, which could fire 5,000 meters, found that the enemy's heavy artillery could outrange them by no less than 3,000 meters. The Common Army had some excellent specialist artillery. The force had designed a superb mountain artillery gun, although only 4 of the 52 mountain batteries had received it by 1914. The army was also equipped with some state-of-the-art fortress-busting 305mm Skoda super-heavy mortars. Neither weapon compensated for deficiencies elsewhere, however, nor for the army's inadequate ammunition stocks. Just 330 rounds per howitzer and 550 rounds per field gun were available, around half that stockpiled by the other great powers. So this is crucial. The stockpiling of artillery is a really important consideration by the end of 1914. Most powers didn't imagine that they were going to be fighting a war that would last several years. Most had planned for short wars, and yet the rapidity with which other powers could convert their industrial base, Britain being the kind of the classic example, to a wartime production economy, was one of the kind of the key factors in victory in the end, and the extent to which it would be an artillery war. The artillery was the number one cause of death on the battlefield, was perhaps underestimated. But it does speak to a kind of a deep-seated structural incompetence, that these deficiencies were there in 1914. And if you happen to be, I did a piece a while back about the kind of the disorganization of the Russian army by 1905, which was considerable, and its kind of inability to learn its mistakes between 1905 and 1914, and to be less organized than that is quite a feat. The tactical skill of the Habsburg infantry was unlikely to compensate for this deficiency in material. The army not only lacked professional NCOs, it also relied more on reservists, whose martial skills were rusty. More on reservists whose martial skills were rusty than was wise. The German army kept its peacetime units at 2/3 strength, so that on mobilization, only the 2 youngest and most recently trained classes of reservists needed to be called to bring them to their full complement. In Habsburg infantry companies, after mobilization, by contrast, only 20 to 25% of the complement were active soldiers undergoing peacetime military training. To fill the ranks, men who had not seen service for a decade had to be drafted. So great was the army's need for that even the Ersatzreservisten, men who had received no more than an annual 8-week military training, were called up. The army denied funding. The army denied funding through Hungarian intransigence in the last decade of peace. Also lacked the equipment and infrastructure needed for an orderly expansion on mobilization. You have to put people somewhere. An awful lot of mobilization is the boring stuff. It is depots and barracks and railways and railway yards and sheds to put huge quantities of stuff. And so you have to have quite skilled planners and thinkers organizing all of this logistical infrastructure so that when a regiment needs to march, its gear is there. When they need to get somewhere by train, which is how mobilization in 1914 happens, the train is there, and there are things like food and water and fuel and coal and all this kind of basic stuff. Most continental conscript armies followed the Prussian model of organizing 3 main lines. The active units that composed the standing army and had the best equipment were filled with men undergoing their peacetime service and topped up with the youngest class of reservists. The depots also kept sufficient equipment, NCOs and officers, to permit the building of a second line, reserve regiments containing trained men aged between 23 and 32. A third line of the less well-equipped Landwehr or territorial units, intended principally for rear area duties, was formed from reservists aged 28 to 38. Additionally, older men up to 45 years of age might be allocated to the Landsturm, police or labour units. The Habsburg Common Army, by contrast, treated its Landwehr and Honved regiments as first line by 1914, and lacked the surplus equipment and officers needed to form extra second-line reserve units and mobilisation. So that's a key weakness. You have to throw everybody into the front line in 1914.
Hey, it's Hannah Burner from Giggly Squad, and we're partnering with Abercrombie for the launch of their new spring collection. I need a wardrobe that can handle a busy week in the city and go straight to a weekend getaway. Abercrombie's newest drop is full of dresses, sweaters, and layers that effortlessly do both. The piece that's stealing the show for me is the new reversible trench coat. It's a classic navy on one side and a coastal plaid on the other, the perfect spring staple. Get your closet ready for a full season of plans. Shop spring at Abercrombie & Fitch in the app, online, and in stores.
Over 90 of the top 100 U.S. accounting firms trust Bill to simplify and secure bill pay. That's proven financial infrastructure built on over $1 trillion of secure payments. Visit Bill.com/proven for a special offer.
To supplement its weak frontline strength, it insisted on the Landsturminfanteriebrigaden, scratch-built militia composed of men aged between 32 and 42, issued with obsolete rifles and easily visible peacetime uniforms, or even just armbands in imperial black and yellow colours. It feels like kind of the Volkssturm at the end of the Second World War in Nazi Germany. Lacking training, equipment, cohesion, and leadership, the March battalions and Landsturm brigades predictably achieved little and suffered horrendous casualties. So these were people, once again, being thrown into the front line. There's some horrifying stories of the first engagements of the international brigades in Spain after 1936, and guys who had never fought before, who essentially are given a little bit of rifle training and some light equipment, a rifle, a helmet, and some other bits and bobs, and are thrown into battle. And in some cases, you're getting 30 to 40% of them are killed. The inexperienced officers, men that don't know anything about the basics of combat, and those that survive become quite proficient soldiers. But it gives you a flavour of what the kind of the Landsturm in the First World War must have faced. These deficiencies were multiplied by a misguided tactical doctrine. The cult of the offensive was an overestimation of the superiority of attack, and a conviction that raw will could beat firepower was embraced by all armies in 1914, but those that felt themselves to be behind in the technological and material race extolled it the most. The French army, with its faith in the offensive d'outrance, is remembered as the most fervent advocates of these attitudes. But the Austro-Hungarian military leadership was no less fanatical in its belief. This was in large measure due to Conrad, the Chief of General Staff, General Conrad, who was considered in the army to be a tactical genius. His key work on the study of tactics had appeared in 1890, and a quarter of a century later he clung to the same principles. Energy, decisiveness, and action were his answers to firepower. The attack, he insists, is the action most suited to the spirit of war. To prepare his men for war, the war of manoeuvre he expected, he put them through ferocious route marches. Disastrously, unlike his German ally, he denied the necessity for combined arms tactics. So, the combination of infantry, artillery, and to the extent that it was operable in 1914, aircraft. His regulations in October 1911, the last issue before the outbreak of the war, insisted that foot soldiers could win the victor's laurels even without support from other weapons and against enemy numerical superiority, if imbued with confidence and aggression and equipped with unbendable steadfastness of will and the greatest physical toughness. The only concession to the destructive effects of firepower was to recommend that troops be deployed in loose skirmish lines, and in practice, even this was frequently disregarded. Time and again, after pre-war manoeuvres, foreign observers criticised the Habsburg troops' slow movement and close formations. Officers stood up behind their firing lines or even stayed on their horses, offering ideal targets. The obliviousness towards terrain, failure to reconnoitre, and lack of cooperation with artillery made these soldiers, in the German military attaché's view, mere cannon fodder. The Central Powers campaign in the summer of 1914 was unrealistic in the demands that it placed on both armies. Capable though it was, the German military was asked to achieve the impossible, a victory over France in just 6 weeks. Even Moltke lacked confidence in the chances of success. He hoped against reason for a quick victory, yet foresaw a horrendous conflict lasting up to 2 years. He had even, albeit half-heartedly, pushed civil authorities to prepare financially and secure the Reich's food supply. The Austro-Hungarian army, led by Conrad, an even more vociferous advocate of preventative war, was grievously unprepared to face Serbia and Russia combined. The decade-long funding freeze imposed by the Hungarian parliament must certainly bear much responsibility. Yet Conrad and his generals were reckless in accepting the task of holding the Russian army, contributed to the delay in their forces' re-equipment with modern artillery, and imposed a tactical doctrine divorced from the reality of the 20th century battlefield. Fatally, neither the German nor Austro-Hungarian military leaders were willing to acknowledge their forces' limitations in operational planning. The soldiers would pay for these illusions. Now, it's quite common when you're looking at the causes of the Russian Revolution to look at Russian deficiency on the battlefield and look at kind of the disasters of places like Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, and eventually the loss of Poland and other kind of catastrophes for the Russians. But when we look at it in context, Russia's biggest rival to the West is Austro-Hungary. And their long-standing kind of resentments towards the Austro-Hungarians, have a significant part to play in the tensions that lead to the outbreak of war. But what we've read there is not far off the kind of incompetence and the kind of almost magical thinking that you see amongst the Russians. There seems to be, the Russian army is much, much bigger, but in terms of competence, the Austrians were not really much different at all. And I think it's important when we consider the context of military preparation, not to look at the Russians as being necessarily outliers here. The French, British, and German armies are all better logistically organized, for sure. But the Austrians and the Russians quite match one another. And in many ways, the Russians actually they kind of throw away many of their key advantages, because the Russian army was pretty well equipped. It was one of the better equipped armies entering the First World War. Okay, so if you like this and you want to support the Explaining History podcast, and also you want to listen to this ad-free, hop on over to Patreon and you can join us there. And for a monthly stipend, pretty reasonable one, you can get ad-free podcasts, and you don't have to be annoyed by whatever commercial horrors poke themselves into these recordings. I, by the way, have absolutely no say whatsoever over the kinds of things that get advertised. So if it's something profoundly unethical, don't blame me. I didn't choose it. Okay, I'll leave you there, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. And let's hope there isn't some kind of world-ending apocalypse between now and then, eh? Take good care. All the best. Bye-bye.
Hey, it's Hannah Burner from Giggly Squad, and we're partnering with Abercrombie for the launch of their new spring collection. I need a wardrobe that can handle a busy week in the city and go straight to a weekend getaway. Abercrombie's newest drop is full of dresses, sweaters, and layers that effortlessly do both. The piece that's stealing the show for me is the new reversible trench coat. It's a classic navy on one side and a coastal plaid on the other, the perfect spring staple. Get your closet ready for a full season of plans. Shop spring at Abercrombie & Fitch in the app, online, and in stores.
When it comes to managing money, forget the hype and look at the results. Bill has $1 trillion of secure payments powering our bill pay tools. Instead of just moving money, Bill is powering the financial operations of nearly 500,000 customers. So stop the guesswork and start scaling with the proven choice. Ready to talk with an expert? Visit Bill.com/proven to get started. And grab a $250 gift card as a thank you. Terms and conditions apply. See offer page for details.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.